I think people will probably start piling in right at about noon. So I see we have some people signing on. Hi, everybody. Just hang tight. We'll probably get started a few minutes after the hour. Yes, I see a question that just came through the chat. You will be muted, but you'll be able to ask questions through the chat. We'll go through all of the logistics in just a couple minutes before we get started. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Happy to see you all here. We're going to wait just a few more minutes. I see we've got people coming in from all over the state. That's fabulous. All right, so we're just a couple of minutes past 12 o'clock and we only have an hour. So I want to make sure we get started and give our speaker as much time as possible to share her talk today. So before we get started, I just have a couple of logistical things to go over. Those of you who have joined us before might be familiar with this, but we're happy to have new people joining our webinar, and I want to make sure we're all on the same page. So first of all, my name is Susie Clark. Excuse me, and I'm a postdoctoral associate at the University of Minnesota. And today we will have a talk from Annie Klodd, who is from the University of Minnesota Extension, and she will be talking about keeping up with climate change on specialty crop farms. For this webinar, she'll be talking for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have time for a Q&A at the end. You are muted, but we encourage you to please ask questions via the chat feature, or via the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. And you can also see what other people have asked, and you can upvote questions that you find particularly interesting. We will be recording this webinar and posting it at a later date on MCAP's YouTube channel, and I will post a link to that in the chat at the end as well. And finally, at the end, I will post a link to our evaluation. We would really appreciate it if you would take 5 minutes to fill this out. I'll remind you again at the end. It helps us ensure that we are reaching the right people and that we are presenting topics that are interesting to you. And we also encourage you to share ideas that you might have for future talks. So it is now my pleasure to introduce Annie Klodd, and she will be, as I said, talking about keeping up with climate change on specialty crop farms. So Annie, take it away.
Thanks, Susie. So yeah, my name is Annie Klodd, and like Susie said, I do work for Extension, and my position is Extension Educator for fruit and vegetable crops. I work mostly with fruit crops though, apple orchards, vineyards, and berry farms, but I also work with pumpkin patches because a lot of apple orchards have pumpkin patches. So a lot of the examples I'm going to be talking about today are centered on fruit. It doesn't mean that vegetable farmers aren't dealing with climate change. It's just the farmers that I work with the most. So yep, I'm going to be talking today about resilience strategies that farmers throughout Minnesota are using to start to address the climate change challenges that they are facing on their farms. And we actually, Susie and I and Heidi Roop worked on a 3-part video series where we went around and interviewed a few different fruit farmers about what strategies they are using. And so during the second part of the presentation, I'm going to be sharing a few of those clips. So just I like to lay out the agenda for what we're going to talk about in the presentation. So first, I'm going to talk about what the impacts of climate change in Minnesota really mean for produce farmers. We also call them specialty crop farmers. And then I'll talk about growers' experiences with and responses to climate change, kind of give some insight into, at least with the fruit growers that I work with, how are they perceiving climate change right now? And then opportunities for plant breeding and crop selection as a climate resilience strategy. I am not a climate scientist. I'll just preface with that. But I do use MCAP's resources and other state of Minnesota resources to try to educate myself about what's already going on with climate change in Minnesota and what the projections are saying. And so some of the biggest impacts that I see for fruit crops in Minnesota are heavier storms, increased precipitation, especially in the spring, a drought, which if it's already happening or if it's projected, heat waves, which as I understand are a projected change at this point in Minnesota, and then earlier spring thaws and later fall freezes. So in other words, a slightly longer season in Minnesota. All of these things have implications for growing specialty crops in our state. So I'm going to be focusing on what do these really mean for those crops. So storms, first of all, if we're seeing if we are going to be seeing an increase in heavy storms in Minnesota, that does a number of things for our fruit farms as well as vegetable farms. And we've seen a number of these examples in the last few years. There was a vegetable farm near Cannon Falls that had a hail event during a large storm last summer in 2020, and they lost almost their entire pepper crop, had to pivot really quickly and sell the damaged peppers to a hot sauce company. But with fruit crops, we have an increased risk of hail damage, fruit rotting, which can occur just if there's too much water getting on the fruit. It can split and then diseases can get in there. But diseases can happen with excess precipitation anyway. So fruit rot is a huge concern for us. Fruit dropping on the ground during heavy windfall events, damage to infrastructure like trellises that you see here. This is a vineyard, and so we've got trellis posts that are wooden going all the way down these rows, which can sometimes be up to 500 feet rows. And so if you have a westward or an eastward wind coming down these rows, they can knock these trellis posts over just with the weight of the vines. What we're seeing in this picture in particular is some of that trellis wire came down because of the weight of the vines during a storm. And it pulled this netting, which is bird netting, down with it. And it doesn't look like a lot, but it actually takes a lot of labor for their employees to go up and try to re-trellis all of those vines, get them straight back up again and put the netting on again. Because as you can see, there's a lot of beautiful high value grapes on those vines right now. Another challenge is flooding, and flooding can be a challenge in a couple of ways. The first, the more obvious one, is that if your field is flooded, a lot of our fruit crops really don't like having what we call wet feet. So if the roots are saturated, they can get diseases and they can just have a lot of trouble taking up nutrients in general. But the other less obvious issue with flooding is a food safety risk. So not so much with this vineyard that we see in the picture, but if you're growing strawberries or vegetable crops, which are all growing right on the ground, if your plants get flooded, depending on the type of flooding and where that flood water is coming from, it can present a really big food safety risk. And so sometimes your crop becomes unsellable if it gets flooded. So if we see increased rainfall in the spring, and in recent years when we have seen this, it has presented some real challenges for farmers, and they're having to pivot pretty quickly and change their plans. Because one of the big things that can happen is if we get a large rainfall event in the spring, it's just physically difficult to get equipment into the fields. So if it's difficult to get equipment into the fields, that means that there are several things that are delayed, such as planting seeds or planting strawberry plants, planting new fruit trees, spraying pesticides, and fertilizing. And even if someone is farming organically, they are still spraying pesticides. So that's something that applies to virtually all of our farms in Minnesota. So none of these tasks can really be done in a timely manner if we keep getting a lot of heavy rainfall events. Flooding, of course, and then rainfall can also interfere with pollination because sometimes our pollinators are not as active if it's kind of cold out, rainy, and they're not getting to those blooms to pollinate everything. So that can be a challenge as well. If we do see increased rainfall in the fall, there are also some different challenges associated with this. It's mainly challenges associated with grapes, apples, and raspberries, which are 3 fruit crops that are still being harvested in the fall. All of our other fruit crops have been harvested during the summer. But if you still have fruit on the trees in the fall and it's starting to ripen, fruit splitting can occur, especially in grapes and apples and some of our stone fruit like plums. Grape diseases like powdery mildew and botrytis gray mold, the vast majority of our diseases really thrive under wet conditions. And so if you're getting diseases right before it's time to harvest your crop, it can really put a damper on your harvest season, or you might have to go in and harvest things before they're actually ready to be harvested, just to try to salvage things and avoid everything getting diseased. There's also a really interesting issue in grapes where if we get a heavy rainfall right before the grapes are ready to be harvested and they're in the middle of ripening, it can dilute the sugar concentration in the berry. And the sugar concentration is one of the three factors that we use to determine when to harvest. So if the sugar concentration isn't high enough, a grower will have to delay their harvest until the sugar concentration gets where it's supposed to be. So if it keeps raining in the fall, that it keeps diluting those sugars, growers get really stressed out about having to wait longer and longer, because of course, the longer you wait, the more time there is for an early freeze or maybe diseases or birds to eat the grapes. And so that's a big stress point for growers. We learned a lot from this drought that we had in 2021, and I still think that it opened up a lot of new questions for us. In extension, we're at University of Minnesota Extension specifically, in our team, we're really used to dealing with issues having to do with excess water. We have less experience dealing with issues of drought and issues of extremely high temperatures, because for most of us on our team, we've been here a few years and we haven't encountered that as much as we have the opposite side of the spectrum. And so we were learning a lot this year. Obviously, drought can stunt plant growth, especially with newly planted trees or newly planted vineyards, for obvious reasons, especially if you don't have irrigation. It can also reduce fruit yield and the actual size of the fruit themselves. And so that affects marketability. If you go to an orchard and you see all the apples are, kind of golf ball size, you're probably not going to be as excited about them as if you go to an orchard and all the fruit are, nice 3-inch wide fruit. Plant death, of course, can occur. And then one of the biggest things that we heard complaints from growers this season was an increased need for irrigation. So even if you have an irrigation system, it doesn't mean that you have unlimited water availability. And so once your wells start running dry, your irrigation ponds start running dry, which is a very real thing that was happening this season, then you get to a point where sometimes you have to choose which fields am I going to irrigate and which ones am I going to let go. So there can be a big economic cost to that. But drought is not all bad for some growers. I mean, if you have a vineyard that's well established, for instance, grapes happen to be a very drought resistant fruit crop compared to most other things that we grow in Minnesota. And so most vineyards don't have irrigation systems because they just honestly don't really need them. And so for a grape grower, they were excited that we had this dry season because there was less disease and less need for fungicides, potentially less insect pest pressure as well. At Pine Tree Apple Orchard, where I'm involved with 2 research projects, I'm out there all the time. We were taking insect counts in traps for one of our projects, and we found very low codling moth and apple maggot populations at that orchard, just probably because of the dry conditions. And Pine Tree told us that they only had to spray fungicide once in 2021, which is really exceptional. Usually you're having to spray a fungicide every 2 to 3 weeks throughout the season, responding to when your rainfall events are. Extreme heat is another thing that a lot of growers in Minnesota and some of us in Extension don't have a lot of experience dealing with. So this is a big learning curve for us in 2021. Stunted plant growth, of course, can occur, but we saw a lot of really funky things like reduced pollination and fruit set due to the extreme heat, which lowers yield. There's a certain temperature at which the pollinators that are important for some of our fruit crops just become less active. In grapes, they don't rely on pollinating insects, they self-pollinate, but pollination is still affected by heat. So in this picture, you see a grapevine with really poor fruit set. These clusters, which are about 2 weeks past bloom, they should be filled with these little green berries, and they're just really sparse. In this picture of this strawberry plant on the bottom, this is an example of sometimes in fruit and vegetable production, we will use black plastic to grow the plants in because it keeps out weeds and it keeps the moisture in. But black plastic really, really heats up when we have a hot season. And so this is a picture of a strawberry plant that was just being fried and stunted by the soil temperature or the plastic temperature. This raspberry that you see over here, this is kind of a common issue that happens when it's extremely dry and we have a lot of sun and it's not very humid. Those fruit can actually get sunburned. So you would not, as a grower, you would not be able to sell or market that raspberry. It's too sunburned. The fruit's going to be crumbly. It doesn't have as much flavor, etc. When we have warmer springs and falls, a lot of people that I talk to, like reporters, they don't always think of this as a negative thing. And I have to be kind of a Debbie Downer about this. But when we have a warmer spring, and I've been seeing this since I was a kid growing up in Iowa on a vineyard, what happens is we get an earlier bud break in fruit crops. Since they're perennials, they're responding to winter and spring temperatures. Buds can break early, and then that makes those buds more vulnerable to any late spring frosts or freezes that we get because they're already out and growing. In a warmer fall, there's not necessarily a lot of problems for fruit crops in Minnesota if our falls are warmer. Usually we have the opposite problem where we're getting a frost too early before things are fully harvested and the trees can't acclimate to the winter. So warmer fall, I have a hard time identifying a lot of problems with that. What's a bigger problem is just the unpredictability from year to year. But with spring frost, I want to expand on that a little bit. I mentioned this in the last slide. And so what you see on the left is a piece of a strawberry row right after a frost last May. We got a frost really late in May in 2021. And we don't care so much about the leaves getting frosted because they can take a little bit of frost. What we care about is these blossoms getting frosted over. So if those are blooming too early, they have a higher risk of getting frosted. And you can see by this black spot in the middle, that's not supposed to look that way, that strawberry blossom has been exposed to a freeze. And this strawberry on the right that you see in the middle of the picture, that is what a frost or freeze affected strawberry looks like. You might still get a berry, but it's going to be really deformed. It's going to be very seedy, might not taste very good, and it's not as marketable. So you would probably have to use that in a pie or a jam instead of selling it fresh, which is a significantly lower market price that you get for that. If you expect a freeze to be coming at night in, say, May, once your plants have already started budding out, let's say you're a blueberry or a strawberry grower, this is a really stressful event for those farmers. So if you wake up in the morning and it says we're getting a freeze tonight, there are basically two things that you can do. Both of them are a little extreme and sound ridiculous. The first one is that you can go out with these thick fabric white row covers and cover everything. So you're covering, if you have 3 acres of blueberry plants, you're covering all of them. And so you kind of have to just call your neighbors or call your staff and say, who can help me get this fabric over my crop? It's not very appealing to somebody with more than a couple acres of crop because it's just extremely time consuming. But it does do a good job of really mitigating that frost risk. The other thing that's much more common as a freeze mitigation strategy is overhead sprinklers. So this seems really counterintuitive, but what the growers do is, and this is very common like throughout the world or at least throughout the US, they have these overhead sprinklers in their field, whether it's strawberries or blueberries, and they have to basically stay up all night. And once the temperatures get to below 32 degrees, they have to turn on their sprinklers and they keep the sprinklers on all night until the temperatures go back below 32 and they can actually see the water dripping off of the plants. So what this does is it actually, the water freezing on the blossoms actually creates a warmer temperature at the surface of the blossom. And so the blossoms have a much higher chance of actually surviving that freeze than if they were just exposed to the open air. However, this is really risky. Like if you're not applying enough irrigation water or if the water isn't freezing fast enough on the plants, it can actually do more harm than good. So growers really have to read up on this process and they are taking a big risk when they do this. But unfortunately, if we're getting those freezes, it's a necessary risk. A common question that I get from a lot of reporters or gardening groups is, with climate change, is this going to allow Minnesotans to grow warmer climate fruit crops? And my take on it is not really, like, at least not in the immediate future. Because even if we're having, warmer average temperatures, that doesn't mean that we're not still getting extreme cold events during the winter. They're still going to occur. Even a few cold dips, minus, one night of minus 30 is going to kill a non-hardy plant like a peach tree. So I'm still definitely not at the point of recommending growers to try to experiment with growing like zone 5 or especially zone 6 crops in Minnesota, because there's still just such a large risk of things dying. The second common question that I get is, will we be able to plant earlier in the spring, whether that's vegetable seeds or fruit trees? And I would say some years, but not all, because if we have a warmer spring, maybe, but it depends on the precipitation, right? So if the fields are really wet and we can't get into the field to till, drive, or to walk in, harvest is still gonna, or sorry, not harvest, that should say planting. Planting is still gonna be delayed regardless of the warmer temperature. So it depends not just on the temperature, but also on precipitation. So now that I've talked about how climate change affects fruit growers and a little bit about vegetable growers, I'm going to go into produce growers' perceptions and experiences with climate change in Minnesota. And this is where I'm going to incorporate some video clips from the project that we did. I just want to start out with a few grower quotes. I'm trying to move my face out of the way corner so I can read them all. Okay. So the first grower who we visited on our video interview tour was John Jacobson at Pine Tree Apple Orchard, who I work with pretty closely on a couple of different projects. And what he said, or one of the many things that he said, was that with climate change, uncertainty is one of our main concerns. Andy Petrin of Twin Cities Berry Company, which is down in Farmington, said that climate change isn't a future abstract idea, it's already happened. How it's taking form for farmers is radical changes in weather events. There's no more normal year anymore. Aaron Wills is at Little Hill Berry Farm, which is a small organic berry farm in Northfield. He says it's not as predictable as it used to be, as far as seasons, bloom times, frost, and precipitation. I think the normal is more unpredictable. And then Laura Frericks, who I actually interviewed her back in 2019. She has an organic vegetable farm in Hutchinson. She said, when you talk about a normal growing season, that just isn't a reality anymore. Every year we're going to have a rainfall event that's 4 to 5 inches, and that's just a given, whereas that would be really unusual a few years ago. So these are how I think this is really interesting, because one of the big takeaways I get from interviewing all these different people is they all use the word, unpredictable, or there's no normal. So they are perceiving that we are really going away from, the normal growing season and having to deal with so many questions every year. All right, so I'm going to start going into the video interviews that we did. So the first one that we went to is Pine Tree Apple Orchard. And what you see in that picture to the right is high density trellised dwarf apple trees, which is very common now. That's the direction that the apple industry in the world is going, is planting apple trees more densely in the rows and having the rows be closer together. You can get a lot more production per acre that way. But the rare and unusual thing that we see in this photo is this netting that's over the trees. And so this is called hail netting. It's just a simple physical exclusion to keep hail damage off of the trees. It's something that Pine Tree is experimenting with. So at Pine Tree, they grow, Sweet Tango, Honeycrisp, First Kiss, Zestar, Harrelson, and then some of our more classic apples like Regent, Chestnut Crab, Macintosh, things like that. And so in the last 3 years, they've started using this hail netting on their highest value varieties, like the first few listed here. At Twin Cities Berry Company, they're a small high density organic berry farm. The owner, Andy Petrin, is pictured here. That's his exclusion structure, which I'm gonna go into that more later. So don't get too distracted with where he's standing. He grows 2 acres of day neutral strawberries, which are the type of strawberries you might have heard them called everbearing. They basically keep producing berries the entire season from when you plant them up until when they get frosted out in the fall. He grows those in caterpillar tunnels as well as exclusion net structures, which I'll go into soon. He has one high tunnel of tabletop strawberries and raspberries. And a high tunnel is sort of like a plastic covered structure that's unheated. It's like an unheated greenhouse, sort of. Little Hill Berry Farm is a small organic berry farm with 5 acres of U-pick blueberries, 5 caterpillar tunnels of day-neutral strawberries, which are pictured here, a high tunnel of raspberries, which he's doing a variety trial on. He planted those in 2020. He also has a U-pick pumpkin patch and sells to local markets like Northfield and the Southern Twin Cities. So I'm going to be talking first about the hail netting at Pine Tree Apple Orchard. So just to kind of recap, when we get hail, this is on the top left, this is what the apples can look like. You know, this picture was taken in June. So this farm this is not from Pine Tree, but the farm where I took this had a hailstorm in early June when the apples were just forming. So the apples keep growing, but they've got these huge scabs on them, which means you can't sell this to the fresh market. You can't sell this for $4 a pound anymore. It's going to be put into cider or just tossed completely. When hail hits a grapevine, this is what it looks like on the bottom left. This is in the middle. This is a vineyard that had a big storm with hail in May, right after all of the shoots started coming out of the vines, completely devastating the vineyard. That was in southeast Minnesota. And this picture on the right is from an apple orchard that had a heavy storm in the fall, right when they were about to harvest their Honeycrisp. And so you're seeing a lot of Honeycrisp on the ground due to the wind. That's a lot of money laying on the ground right there. So the Minnesota apple production industry is estimated at about 18 million per year by the USDA. Apple prices in Minnesota are between about $2 to $4 per pound, depending on the variety and how they're being marketed. And when we get a hail event, hail makes each apple unmarketable in the fresh market. So you're either using it for cider or you're throwing it away. The U of M Horticulture Research Center in 2020 had about a 90% crop loss in their apples due to one single hail event that happens in September. And this picture on the far right is what those apples look like. So these apples here, these are ripe apples on the right, and they had just been hailed on. And so that's an open wound that created. That's going to create too much infection in the apple. That can't even be used for cider anymore. And so it's a pretty big loss. Most Minnesota growers don't have insurance for hail, at least not specialty crop growers. A lot of them just don't have crop insurance in general. And the perception is among a lot of these growers is currently that the programs that exist just aren't sufficient for their needs. They're meant for larger farms, not smaller farms, and not super high value crops. And so a lot of them don't have insurance, and they're trying to rely on other more cultural methods for management. All right, so hail netting at Pine Tree. It protects the trees from hail from about petal fall, which is when those flower petals are falling off the trees in late May, all the way through harvest. So you take the netting off right before you're ready to harvest. You keep it on as long as possible. Hail netting is still a new practice in general, like throughout the world. It has pretty low adoption. So the fact that Pine Tree is doing this is pretty innovative. It's a simple, concept. You're just putting on net and then you're taking it off. It just physically protects the trees. But the upfront cost of buying the netting and the application equipment is expensive. And so growers have to weigh that against their potential risk for hail. So actually knowing more about the relative risk and the statistics around hail in Minnesota would be really helpful for growers to figure out how probable it is now and in the future for them to get a hail event. And then they can calculate that loss against the cost of getting hail netting, but we're not quite there yet. The mesh size, I just wanted to show you how fine this netting is. So it's just fine enough to keep out hail, but yay, it can also keep out a lot of insect pests. So these are pictures of applying and removing hail, which I'm about to show a video of as well. But first, I just wanted to say that since the hail netting does have a high upfront cost, Pine Tree reached out to us a couple of years ago about collaborating on a project where we are trying to see if hail netting can also be effective at keeping out insect pests. If it is, then that adds another huge economic benefit of hail netting besides just hail exclusion. And so far, we're finding extremely positive results. of that research, which is really exciting. All right, now I'm going to show the first video. And Susie and I tested out the audio here before everyone came in, and our audio was okay, but Susie said that it's a little bit quieter than you're hearing me right now, so you might want to turn your volume up if you can.
Well, we're looking at a high-density dwarf planting of sweet tangos. The netting used it to protect us against the hail in the event of a severe thunderstorm. The hail would certainly damage all the apples on the trees, and this gives us some protection, or 100% protection from the hail of a severe thunderstorm. Poco pesado. Este aquí, perfecto. We used to have 2/10 to half an inch rains. Now it's 2-inch rains, high winds, devastating hail, and it's just made us uncertain. Anywhere from 50 to 85% damage to a crop, and that, as far as us being a direct marketer, that is a very concerning issue for us. With the advent of a lot of high-value apples for the direct market, Honeycrisp, Sweet Tango, Zestar, it was appropriate for us to net that high value because there's just not enough out there to repurchase. The amount of benefit that we derive from the netting, where if you have a hail event, it will pay for itself on one event. Down at our farm in southern Minnesota 2 years ago, we put the netting up early June. Late June, we had a hailstorm. Everything that was under the netting was 100% fine. Anything that was not netted was 85% loss. It will last approximately 10 to 15 years. I would say to someone that if you're getting hail within 30% of the time, or 3 times out of 10 years, very, very beneficial for you to have this.
Since the economic cost up front of hail netting is very high, we are looking at other potential economic benefits of having the netting, such as insect exclusion. Pilot data from last year was very promising, suggesting up to a 90% reduction in codling moth when the netting is applied. And so we're doing an experiment for the next 2 seasons at this orchard to see just how effective exclusion netting can be at excluding insects as well as hail.
All right. Isn't that cool? I especially liked seeing,
Well, we're looking at
now I'm trying to, okay. I especially enjoyed watching the hail netting be applied and taken off. I thought that was really interesting. So it usually takes like 4 guys behind the tractor and 1 driving the tractor, and then 1 guy who is using zip ties to clip the net at the bottom. So the net is secure the whole season. It's not just draped on the ground. Okay, so that was hail, and that was really cool. And there are a lot of other climate change impacts that I talked about earlier, and I'm just going to review those really quickly in order to transition into our next couple of videos, which are on protected culture to exclude all of these elements. So again, heavy rainfall periods can bring disease, field flooding, more weeds. Drought and extreme heat damage can lead to low yields, fried or dead plants, slow plant growth, and other issues that we're not so familiar with. And then potential increases in invasive insect pests due to longer and warmer seasons. So in an open field like this is a strawberry field. This is what a strawberry field looks like before June, when the plants are just coming up and starting to bloom. This is like a $20,000 per acre revenue field as a U-pick strawberry field. And this field is just subject to all the elements. It's just wide open there. And so farmers are taking on a lot of risk with these kinds of crops. So one of the big ways that a lot of farms, not just in Minnesota, but throughout the world, are dealing with this is through what we call controlled environment agriculture, which is getting more and more popular in Minnesota. This is also called protected culture. So these are using methods that protect the crops physically from multiple climate change impacts. Some examples, well, the main examples are first high tunnels, which you see over in this picture to the right. This is what a typical high tunnel looks like in Minnesota, but high tunnels can be much, much larger than this as well. And caterpillar tunnels would be the next one. That's this middle photo here is a small caterpillar tunnel. So caterpillar meaning that it's just tall enough for you to walk in. They're typically about 100 feet long. And you can fit, 3 to 4 rows of your crop underneath. These are usually just used for annual crops though. And then exclusion net structures, which are newer and more innovative technology where you're putting insect exclusion net over an entire small field of usually a fruit crop in order to keep out invasive insect pests. High tunnels, again, they're quite common in other regions, especially berry producing regions of the world, such as Quebec, California, Israel, other parts of Europe. They're slowly catching on in Minnesota for fruit crops. I mean, we use high tunnels a lot for vegetable crops, but it's slowly becoming more common for farmers to say, hey, I don't want to grow raspberries in the open field anymore because my raspberries are rotting and falling off when it rains. They're kind of small. They're not great. There's a lot of insect pressure. So more and more farmers are turning to growing raspberries and strawberries inside of these high tunnels. You can see on the left here the beautiful quality, size, and consistency in size that you can get just by growing them in more of a controlled environment. So yeah, I would just say the take home is that berries, especially strawberries and raspberries, they're really high value crops. We're talking like $6 a pint or more at a farmer's market in the Twin Cities. And so these are good candidates for taking up that, that primo real estate that a high tunnel is. Caterpillar tunnels are pictured here. And so it's kind of the same concept as a high tunnel where you've got plastic over a metal structure, and then you can roll up these sides. You can kind of see that in the middle photo, how these sides are rolled up to let more airflow through. So you can control how much wind is getting through there. You can control the temperature to some extent. These are a lot cheaper than high tunnels. One 100-foot caterpillar tunnel runs you about $2,000 versus about $12,000 for a 70-foot high tunnel. But of course, caterpillar tunnels are smaller. They're good for beginning farmers who want to try it. They can only really be used for annual crops like day neutral strawberries and vegetables that are planted every year, because typically you're moving around your caterpillar tunnels every year. You're not keeping them up in the same place from winter to winter. These are exclusion net structures. The main point of these is for insect pest exclusion. And I will talk more about that in a second. But this is me standing outside one in Quebec. This is about a 1/4 acre insect exclusion net, and he's got blueberries planted under there. So you go in there, you zip it up behind you, and then the idea is that no invasive insects can get in there. This is what one looks when both of these photos are what they look like when you're standing inside them. So you can stand upright as long as you've constructed it and supported it correctly. You can stand inside these and harvest just fine. So why use exclusion net? Because it seems like a lot of work, right? It's brought on by this insect pest called spotted wing Drosophila. I'm not going to go into this because there's so many webinars and online resources about spotted wing Drosophila if you're interested in learning more. But it's this invasive insect pest, which is really driving a lot of increased costs of berry production throughout the country. It costs millions of dollars in damage each year just in Minnesota, and it increases the amount that farmers have to spray insecticides, whether they're organic or non-organic. If you're growing berries in an open field without some sort of insect netting, you're having to spray just about every week while those crops are in season, because spotted wing Drosophila is just such a prolific and damaging pest. It causes the fruit to basically rot when it lays its larvae inside of them. So farmers are really motivated to find non-chemical ways to keep spotted wing Drosophila out. So to talk more about that, we went to Twin City Berry Company, pictured here, and he has caterpillar tunnels as well as the exclusion net. So I'm going to play an interview with farmer Andy Petrin of Twin City Berry Company here.
Great.
For the last stop on our farm tour, we're heading a little bit north to a berry farm in Farmington. Here, grower Andy Petrin has been working hard to keep spotted wing Drosophila off of his strawberries.
So the two biggest things for us are disease pressure due to these massive fluctuations in climate and weather events, and then pressure from invasive species. So those two have combined together to make open field production of small fruit almost completely unviable. Spotted wing Drosophila really likes it when it's wet and when the humidity is high. So in 2019, the SWD, that's what we call it, spotted wing, was probably the worst year that we've had in recent memory. Even if you have completely fantastic cultural practices, you can lose your entire crop in a matter of a couple weeks because they attack fruit that's completely intact. The way to protect our future of fruit production here, I think, is to actually physically protect the fruit in the present. Because if you create exclusion environments like this, you can bring the good guys in, so you can bring pollinators in, and you can keep the bad guys from coming in from the outside. But it also means I don't have to spray nearly as much. After I finish my tunnels, I do one spray, right, just to knock it out. And then if the exclusion environment stays intact, I never have to spray again for the entire year.
All right, so that's the first clip. He was talking about his caterpillar tunnels. And I have one more clip. I wanted to show you the exclusion netting.
Creating a net structure is fairly simple. All you need is galvanized pipe that you stick vertically into the ground around the perimeter of whatever you want to net off. And then to save money, you can use PVC pipe and put it in the center. I strung almost a grid system together, connecting all of those pipes. And then after that, you just throw the net over it. It's called 80-gram mesh netting. The mesh is just so tightly woven that even really, really small bugs like spotted wing Drosophila can't come in. And it even keeps a little bit of the water off as well, so there's slightly less disease pressure on the plants in these really, really wet years. I'm going to have a little bit more than an acre in completely netted production this year. And because of the increase in marketable yields, I expect to have the equivalent of 2 acres of berry production on my 1 acre of netted field.
All right. I'll be curious to hear what you guys think about that in the chat. Okay, so the last farm that we went to was Little Hill Berry Farm. It sounds like the audio on this might be a little too quiet. If it's too quiet, somebody tell us in the chat and we'll just skip by this video. But I wanted to show it to you if possible.
My name is Aaron Wills. We are at Little Hill Berry Farm in Northfield. A word I would use to describe climate change would be unpredictable. We're flowering earlier because we're warmer. But then, so for this year, we almost get something around Mother's Day frost. We've had it 2 years in a row, but we've had earlier spring, so we've lost blueberries. The high tunnels allow us to kind of weather the unpredictability of climate change. One of the diseases that we're trying to mitigate with using tunnels is anthracnose. So in the past, before we were going in tunnels, had a lot of challenges with anthracnose, which is spread by water, typically. Another one would be powdery mildew. And so by keeping the leaves dry, we can keep those diseases in check. We just get way more marketable fruit because none of the fruit gets ruined from rain or disease. And so ultimately, it's just a lot more, it is more viable, more profitable to grow them in a tunnel.
Wow, look at these berries. They're so big. Can you believe that?
Oh my gosh, yeah, I can't believe it how early they are, June 24th. The berries will probably be bigger in the tunnel. They'll be what you expect them to look like in the grocery store. So it's hard to produce that in Minnesota outside, like a large amount of them. So, but you can do it in the tunnel. Comparing the high tunnel to like outdoor rows, my guess is that we'll have about 4 times the yield. It's looking beautiful. Plants are vigorous and healthy. Berries are starting to form.
All right, so those were our farm tours. And I just want to make, in these last couple of minutes here before we do questions, I included a few slides about plant breeding and climate resilience, because we also interviewed Dr. Matt Clark at U of M about fruit breeding efforts that are going on for climate change resilience. I don't have a lot of time to talk about this though, but the first problem that plant breeding, I think, can help address is that issue of when we have warmer springs leading to early bud break and then bud death due to that early bud break. I think that's one opportunity for crop selection and fruit breeding, because growers could, if the varieties are available, they could select crop types and varieties that naturally have later bud break or bloom, or are less resistant to, or sorry, more resistant to that early warm up that we get in the spring. For example, grapes and raspberries bloom in late June rather than blooming in May. So if someone is just starting a farm, they may choose to grow crops that start blooming later. Another thing is growers can choose crop types and varieties with more cold hardy buds. So we could be breeding for crops that have more cold hardy buds, or growers can just say, hey, I'm worried about climate change. I'm going to grow something that's more cold hardy. For instance, blueberry and honeyberry buds, even though they are popping pretty early, like mid-May, they tend to withstand colder temperatures than things like strawberries, grapes, and apples. Problem number two is what I mentioned earlier with grapes and apples about increased rainfall during fall harvest, which causes fruit splitting, grape diseases, and delayed grape ripening. And so I think that there are opportunities in plant breeding to breed for more disease-resistant fruit varieties, definitely. This is already happening at University of Minnesota, but there's a lot more opportunity there. That the opportunity for that never ends. But for example, the Itasca grape, which was released in 2017 by U of M, has powdery mildew and downy mildew resistance built into it. And the Triumph apple, which was just released by the U of M apple breeding program last year, has apple scab resistance. Another example is later blooming or earlier ripening varieties. So they just have a shorter season, less potential for bloom or harvest issues. So early season apples like First Kiss, Zestar, Sweet Tango. Grape varieties that are harvested earlier, like Brianna, Edelweiss, Itasca, and Marquette, that all ripen before the middle of September. But there's a lot of breeding that has to be done on this still, especially with grapes, because it doesn't just matter that they ripen earlier. They also have to be high quality wine grapes that growers actually want to grow. So a lot of opportunities here. If you would like to watch the video where we interviewed Dr. Matt Clark about the plant breeding efforts going on with climate change, this is the link here. The name of the video is Climate Change and Fruit Crops, Growing Resilient Crops, and that is on YouTube. So I'll share resources in a second, but I just wanted to thank all of the growers who we interviewed for this project, Matt Clark, Gail Hudson Media, who produced the videos with us, and then Susie Clark and Heidi Rue. So if you'd like to watch the full videos, they're on the U of M Extension Small Farms YouTube channel. Just go there and look on the fruit and vegetable playlist, or you can just go to YouTube and search Climate Change and Fruit Crops U of M. I also like to plug our team's newsletter, which is the U of M Extension Fruit and Vegetable News, where we send weekly e-newsletters with articles on fruit and vegetable growing recommendations to farmers throughout Minnesota. So if you're interested in a deep dive into fruit and vegetable production, please feel free to subscribe. Okay, so that's all. So I'm going to take questions, but I'll leave this resources slide up.
Thank you, Annie. I actually have just found a couple of those videos, so I'll go ahead and drop those links in the chat in case people would like to take a look at those.
Awesome.
So we actually have several questions, which is great. I'm going to try to go through them as quickly as possible because we have about 10 minutes. Sorry, I'm multitasking, dropping these links in the chat right now. So we had several questions that were about the logistics of the netting and the tunnels and these different methods that farmers are using. So there were a couple of questions related to, first, how much does the hail netting cost? And second, do you have to put it on and take it off every season, or do you leave it on for years?
You take the netting off and on every season, but you can reuse it for years and years. I mean, it's meant to be used for 15 to 20 years before you have to replace it. The speed of replacement just depends on how much you tear it when you're putting it on or taking it off. I was just at the orchard yesterday and I got the numbers on costs, and I don't have all of that information in my head. It was like $350 per roll of netting, and the netting is 7 meters long, so that's wide enough to go over the trees. And I think a roll of netting was like, I don't remember how long the rolls are, but they're $350 per roll. And then the piece of equipment that you have to use to apply the netting, unless, you know, sometimes farmers will build this stuff on their own. They're really innovative. But if you buy the net applicator, which is called a Net Whiz, it's $18,000.
And the farmer in the first video talked a little bit about this, about how it can basically pay for itself in one storm. Have you heard that sentiment from other people that you've worked with? And does it pay for itself if there's not a storm? Is it still beneficial for farmers?
Yeah, so John does feel that it pays for itself with one storm. There's obviously like, what's it called? Scales of production.
Economies of scale.
Thank you, economies of scale. Because the applicator is $18,000, and then you would buy the amount of netting for the number of acres that you have. So John has a really big farm. So if, you know, it would be pretty easy for him to lose $18,000 in one hailstorm. That no problem. But for a smaller farm that maybe he just has an acre of apple trees, I would think that they would want to make the equipment themselves or just use ladders to put it up, because it would take a lot of hailstorms for them to lose $18,000. Well, maybe just one, honestly. But yeah, if hail is going to be happening more frequently, then it makes it more worth it, right? I'm looking forward to more data on that when we have enough data to say what those trends are going to be. You know, I showed information about the insect exclusion project we're doing. We're trying to see, you know, what added economic benefit do we get by excluding insect pests with that netting? And we think that's going to be significant. We have an an agricultural economist involved with the project, and she's going to actually be calculating that to see if that added benefit makes it more worth it for farmers, because we would like them to have the hail netting, regardless of whether or not they're getting a lot of hail, because then it's there when they need it.
Yeah. And for those of you who might be less familiar with the climate science that we're working off of, the jury's still out in terms of what we project will happen with hail. It's very difficult to model those sorts of storms because they happen on small scales. So MCAP is actually currently spinning up a project that will hopefully allow us to model extreme storms better. But there is already evidence that we're seeing increased insect pressure and increased disease pressure from climate change. So I'm going to go ahead and jump to a different question. Let's see, we have so many here in the chat. Well, this is actually related to what I just mentioned. The question is, how is climate change impacting invasive insect species and crop pest issues? Is there an effort to leverage natural pest suppression from locally diverse landscapes and biological control agents? Or is there more of a focus on exclusion techniques? Or are the issues too crop specific and pest specific to generalize?
So as far as like how much is climate change impacting invasive species, I feel like we need more data on that, because anecdotally, I shared examples of how like in 2021, it was really dry and we had lower SWD pressure according to the farmers, but that doesn't necessarily go along with our data at U of M, for one. And for two, we don't know if that was because of the drought. So there might be a lot of studies going on this that I don't know about, but right now, like at this point, I'm not finding a lot. Maybe Susie can jump in on that, but I will just say, as far as somebody mentioned biological controls, there has been a lot more research on the use of beneficial insects in the environment in order to help control invasive pests, but usually it's not enough. Usually they're invasive for a reason, right? Because their populations are so resilient. And so usually, even if there are natural predators present who will help kill some of the invasive insects, the populations of those invasives are so big that it doesn't make a sizable difference. That's usually what ends up occurring. So right now, like, I'm really interested in exclusion. But Susie, do you have more to say about invasive insects and climate change?
Yeah, so I guess I should clarify what I said, which is that the projections are much more confident for invasive insects than they are for hail. So there have already been signs and evidence in other places around the country about how pest pressure is increasing as a result of climate change. But what I was talking about was more that we project that will be one of the major stressors as a result of climate change, whereas the projections on hail are still unclear. So that's the clarification of what I was talking about. So I have a couple of logistical questions again about the caterpillar tunnels. So shifting a little bit away from the netting. Essentially, one being, how long does a caterpillar tunnel last? And second, I'm not quite sure the exact context for this question, but it is, do you spray from outside or inside the high tunnels? And I'm assuming that that refers to pesticides or fungicides.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, both really good questions. So the metal support posts in a caterpillar tunnel, those can last for years and years, 20, 30, however long, metal takes to degrade before you have to throw it away. But the plastic, you might have to replace the plastic every few years. I think a lot of farmers do try to reuse their plastic as much as possible, because I've never met a farmer who loves wasting plastic. But after a few years of taking on and off, it is going to get worn out. And then, yeah, you spray inside. If you've got a caterpillar or a high tunnel, you are going inside and spraying it there.
Great. And so we have time for one more question before we get to 1 p.m. And this one, I think maybe we should joint answer this one. It's a bit of a speculative question. It is, as many fruit crops come from medium to long-lived species and can be grown in areas with more permanent cover, can these locations be used as carbon sinks and long-term sequestration sites? I'm not sure if you've had questions similar to this before, Annie.
I'm glad that you're here, because I don't get asked about carbon sinks and I don't have enough knowledge about that.
So my response to that question would be that, in general, converting from natural landscapes to agriculture tends to produce carbon dioxide rather than absorb it. Natural forests are much more efficient at absorbing carbon. And so the effort in that direction is typically more in the direction of, how can we restore some of the forests that have been taken down in order to be converted to farmland? So I would not say that that is one of the main goals of these specialty crop farmers. Their main goal is, we all need to eat something, and they are producing the food that we all need to eat. And also, it's an important distinction between mitigating climate change, which is absorbing carbon dioxide, the sequestration problems, trying to prevent climate change from happening. That's one issue, that's mitigation. And here we're talking about adaptation, which is climate change is already happening and we can expect it to continue. So how do we adapt to it? How do we change our practices in anticipation of these changes, as these farmers are doing, such that we can continue to produce what we need to produce? So, and I'm aware that we have a couple of other questions that have gone unanswered. I apologize for that. I'm really happy to see this much engagement. So Annie, I wonder if it would be all right for me to drop your UMN email into the chat for people to follow on if they have more. Great.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let me just go ahead and copy that. It's actually, Annie, would you mind doing that? Because you have it right in your head. There it is. And for everyone who's still on, thank you for sticking with us until the end. I have a couple of links that I'm going to drop for you as well in the chat. First, if you'd like to subscribe to our email list, there's that link for that. And as I mentioned at the beginning, we have an evaluation, and we would be very thankful if you would take 5 minutes to go through that evaluation and let us know what you think. And thank you so much, Annie, for joining us today. Really appreciate it. It was a very interesting talk.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It was so fun to talk to this group. Great questions.
Yeah. All right, thank you all. Please feel free to email Annie with any of your remaining questions.
All right. See you later, Susie.
Bye.